By 1750, all the preconditions for modernity were in place, but the world was still in a very traditional state. Some spark was needed to push humans across the next threshold of complexity into the age of modernity. That spark, both literal and metaphorical, was the burning of a substance laid down by geological processes millions of years ago, a substance called coal. It was lit on a small and hitherto relatively obscure island off the northwestern edge of Eurasia. With under 1% of the world's population in the early 18th century, in a little over 100 years, this island would come to dominate the planet. The Industrial Revolution that took off in Britain transformed the world, unlocking vast new sources of fossil energy that powered a dramatic increase in innovation. Mass production by machines in factories burning fossil fuels swept away millennia of cottage industry and fundamentally changed political and social structures as a consequence. Even if the British themselves were not quite aware of what they had started, contemporaries in Europe certainly were. In 1837, Frenchman Louis Blanqui named this La Révolution Industrielle, although it was English historian Arnold Toynbee who popularized the phrase Industrial Revolution in the 1880s. Industrialization allowed humans to cross the next threshold of complexity, a threshold that big historians call modernity, reshaping their societies for the first time since the introduction of agriculture 10,000 years earlier. The burning of fossil fuels allowed humans to defy, at least for a time, the predictions of Thomas Malthus, who had argued that all upswings in population and societal progress would inevitably reach a ceiling and would be followed by inevitable decline. But Malthus was thinking of agrarian societies, the only type that had existed since the end of the Paleolithic, where populations were limited by the availability of known resources supplied by nature. By unlocking the energy of fossil fuels, humanity gained access to a seemingly unlimited new resource that Malthus could not have foreseen. The question of why the Industrial Revolution began in Britain and not somewhere else has occupied historians for centuries, but the key factors seem to be the ready availability of money, cheap labor, raw materials, energy sources, and a pre-capitalist social structure. Other parts of the world had some of these characteristics, but not all of them, and elsewhere there were few incentives to encourage entrepreneurs. For millennia, China had the global edge in innovation, yet decisions made by conservative governments not to support large-scale expeditions or innovation meant the Chinese gradually slipped behind. By the mid-18th century, Britain was also part of the new hub of global trade, which brought in raw materials such as cotton, sugar, and timber produced with cheap slave labor, helping entrepreneurs amass huge amounts of capital. Britain also had good resources of coal and coastlines and rivers that helped with trade and transportation of coal. And of course, as an island nation, Britain had natural defenses against invasion. Once it began, the Industrial Revolution quickly transformed Britain from an agrarian state into an industrial nation and from a tribute-taking society into a commercialized society, the first such transformation in history. It is hardly surprising that the first stage of the revolution was felt in the agricultural sector. Britain was still very much a traditional agrarian state in the 17th century, but it was primed for transformation. Aristocrats ran their farms for profit and peasants worked for wages. The Enclosure Acts passed by Parliament had given landowners the right to increase their properties by buying land that had previously been accessible to small-scale farmers. Large profit-making farms soon appeared that encouraged innovation in crop rotation and the use of technology to sow and harvest. British agricultural production and efficiency soared, increasing output by 350% while reducing the labour force by 50%. Unwanted farm labourers moved to the cities, creating a growing market for agricultural produce and consumer goods, as well as a cheap source of labour for hire. The next stage of the revolution coupled steam engines and textile production. The engines burned coal, solar energy trapped in ancient swamps laid down between 345 and 280 million years ago during the Carboniferous period. How was it created? Photosynthesizing plants had stored extrasolar energy that under ordinary circumstances would have been lost in the decay process after they died. But if such plants fall into water, decay is prevented because there is no oxygen to allow this process to happen. The dead plants sink deeper and deeper, pressure from the weight of the materials above compresses them, and they turn into peat and then into coal. Britain had depended on wood for most of its energy before industrialization, but by the 18th century it had begun to run out of wood. So Britons turned to coal for heating and cooking, sinking mines deeper and deeper until groundwater seeped in and flooded the shafts. This was the context in which steam engines were invented to more efficiently pump water out of the mines. Early in the 1700s, Thomas Newcomen designed a steam engine with a piston pushed by steam, but it was so inefficient that it proved almost useless. It was Scottish inventor James Watt who built a much more efficient steam engine. It pumped larger quantities of water and could also be applied to drive other types of machinery. In the early 1800s, Watt's steam engine was attached to spinning and weaving machines, which made rapid, cheap mass production of textiles possible, driving down the price of cotton cloth by 80%. By the middle of the 19th century, textiles had become the largest business in Britain, employing 500,000 people out of 12 million total. They had also destroyed the comparatively inefficient cotton industry in India with cheap British exports, the first sign of the huge shift in global power that was about to occur. It wasn't long before the iron and steel industry was similarly transformed. Using a technique pioneered by Abraham Darby, which involved smelting iron by burning coke instead of charcoal, British iron production soared. Later, Henry Bessemer built a blast furnace to produce an even stronger version of iron, steel, although we shouldn't forget that the Chinese Han Dynasty had managed something similar 2,000 years earlier. These developments in the coal-fired steam engine and iron production led to a dramatic expansion in railway and maritime transportation. By the mid-19th century, almost 13,000 miles of rail tracks had been laid across Britain, and steamships were crossing the Atlantic Ocean. This was a veritable explosion of innovation, a revolution driven by collective learning that allowed humans to soar past the dying-off point Thomas Malthus had predicted. The British population and standard of living reached unprecedented levels, and London became the largest city on earth. London hosted the first World's Fair in 1851, showing off the fruits of British innovation in a vast hall dubbed the Crystal Palace, itself a marvel of structural engineering made of iron and glass covering 19 acres. This damp little island had led the world into the modern era. But more than that, Britain had established a model for industrialization that could be imitated by other nations in which similar preconditions existed. And in the second wave, Belgium, France, Prussia, and the United States all joined the club. The new nation of the United States of America had enormous advantages. Huge expanses of land it had taken from native peoples, no traditional elites, no legal class distinctions, and isolation from Europe's wars. The young nation had a clean slate and could adopt technology quickly. Industrialization commenced in the textile industry in the 1820s, led by private entrepreneurs who had memorized British trade secrets. The US government helped in the expansion of railroads by providing grants of land, but otherwise it was private companies using loans from European banks that financed the construction. The brutal US Civil War between 1861 and 1865, which can accurately be called the world's first industrial war, led to a dramatic intensification of industrialization across the northern states as they arranged themselves to manufacture war material. By 1901, Andrew Carnegie's US Steel Corporation had an annual budget 3 times that of the US government, and the US was producing 24% of the global output of manufactured goods compared to Britain's 19%. Already, the political and military balance of global power was being reshaped. The next wave of industrialization occurred in Japan and Russia. Japan was under the threat of colonization by Western powers, and this led to a radical change in that country's direction when 15-year-old Emperor Meiji came to the throne in 1868. The emperor and his government were determined to transform Japan by emulating everything that the West had achieved. A partnership between the government and feudal aristocrats financed the modernization of the agricultural sector and the mechanization of silk production. But Japan lacked crucial natural resources like oil and decided to seek these through military expansion into Korea and Manchuria, defeating both Chinese and Russian forces in the process. Through these policies, Japan industrialized at a faster rate than the West and much, much faster than Russia. As late as 1860, Russia was still a traditional tributary agrarian state dominated by the Tsar and nobility, while most of the population were peasant serfs working the huge estates as virtual slaves. Between 1861 and 1865, Tsar Alexander II freed some 47 million state-owned serfs and then pushed through a series of industrial reforms, creating banks, hiring foreign experts, and launching a massive railroad program linking Russia to Siberia and East Asia. These reforms worked, and by 1900, Russia had joined the ranks of the world's leading nations. But social tensions grew until massive workers' strikes broke out in Moscow and St. Petersburg in 1905 that were brutally suppressed. A disastrous experience in the First World War led to revolution in 1917 that brought the Communist Party to power, which then had to figure out how to sustain industrialization in Russia. Everywhere that industrialization occurred, the old structures of traditional civilizations were forced to give way to a new vision of the state, the nation. Starting in ancient times, as we have seen, states and systems of governance have evolved, from the first city-states of Sumeria to the Empire of Sargon to the great agrarian civilizations of Afro-Eurasia and the Americas. The nation-state was the latest stage in this progression. Each stage made more resources available to governments, allowing them to reach further into the private lives of citizens, as seen in the expanding powers of the military, for example. In the nation-state, governments promoted nationalist ideologies to gain the support and loyalty of their citizens, emphasizing a common language and a common history to create a powerful new geopolitical ideology in place of the monarchic, dynastic, and imperial state models that had preceded it. The nation-state took much tighter control of the economy, increasing taxes to pay for services like public education and infrastructure developments. The first example of the modern nation-state appeared in France, an unexpected product of the violent French Revolution that almost overnight swept away all the trappings of the ancient regime, including most emphatically the royal family. After the revolution, the new National Assembly established an administrative bureaucracy, modernized the economy, took control of state education, and tripled the size of the national army, also opening officer positions to citizens of all social backgrounds. In 1799, General Napoleon Bonaparte, whose rise in the army was only made possible by these reforms, seized power in France and used nationalism to mobilize popular support for his attempt to build a French empire. Even after he was eventually overthrown, all the administrative reforms of the revolution were retained, leaving real power within the state civil apparatus. This meant that France had essentially created the modern state, controlled not by hereditary aristocrats, but by a powerful central administration and elected representatives. But the French did something more, turning the revolution's claims of equality, freedom, and natural rights into an aversion against the types of harsh punishment that had characterized the monarchy. The American Congress was first to articulate this concept of human rights in 1776, and this was followed by the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789. These declarations fueled increasing demands to abolish slavery, which the French did first, followed by the Danes, the British, and the US. During the 19th century, virtually all industrialized states followed the French reforms, and by 1914, the modern state had become the norm in most countries of the world. The modern state then was a product of industrialization, and this had implications for the relationship between the state and the economy. Scottish philosopher Adam Smith argued that the state should limit excessive regulation and allow the economy to function as free of government intervention as possible. Although Smith did see a role for government in enforcing contracts, granting patents, and developing infrastructure, In The Wealth of Nations, he extolled the virtues of free enterprise, arguing that the very self-interest of commerce was the only regulating principle the economy required. Adam Smith's ideas remain influential today, particularly in the United States, where the major parties in the US are still divided over the degree that government should regulate economic activity. But there is another even deeper divide that we can associate with industrialization, and that is the division of the world into two halves. Similar to the division ushered in by the agricultural revolution 10,000 years earlier, in which foraging persisted in some regions, while in others sedentary farming and all its consequences became the norm. The Industrial Revolution allowed industrial nations to become wealthy and powerful enough to impose their will upon the non-industrialized world. Ever since the appearance of agrarian civilizations, the powerful had been able to impose their will on the less so. The Romans had the military and economic power to create a huge empire, as did the Mongols, the Aztecs, and so on. But industrialized nations had power on an entirely new scale. In 1800, Europeans occupied or controlled 35% of the land surface of the world. By 1914, this had risen to 84% as a consequence of the second wave of European empire building. Britain, the first industrial power, created the largest non-contiguous empire the world had ever seen, so big that it was called the empire on which the sun never sets. At any time of the 24-hour day, the sun was always shining on a part of the British Empire. Controlling such extensive territory required immense military might, which was possible because of the immense wealth industrialization had generated. By the end of the 19th century, the gap between the world's richest and poorest countries was simply enormous. And this was something entirely new. In pre-industrial periods, levels of wealth did not differ that much from region to region, although of course there were big differences between classes within societies. But after the Industrial Revolution, the gap between the richest and poorest regions of the world, the developed and undeveloped worlds, was something like 50-1. This change was felt most painfully in formerly wealthy states like China and India, who had dominated global economic output in 1750, but by 1900 had become two of the poorest countries in the world. In India, the Mughal Empire, which had ruled there since the mid-1500s, broke apart, and the British East India Company used its private army to seize control. British textiles flooded the Indian market and destroyed traditional production, forcing many Indians to return to farming export cash crops like sugarcane, cotton, and opium poppies. The British made a massive profit selling Indian opium in China, reversing the structure of global trade as silver now flowed out of China and back into England. In China, population grew rapidly, and with no industrial sector, the Chinese focused on ever more intensive agriculture, refusing British attempts to gain more access to valuable exports like tea and silk. In the 19th century, the British forced the Chinese to accept opium instead of silver, using their powerful military and gunboats to defeat Chinese forces in the Opium Wars. By the late 1800s, perhaps 10% of China's population were opium users, and China was consuming 95% of the world's supply. A weakened Qing dynasty was powerless in the face of the brutal Taiping Rebellion, a revolt of the working class that cost around 20 million lives. And also a second revolt, the Boxer Rebellion, a peasant rebellion that sought to expel all foreigners from China. The latter was only put down when Western powers helped suppress it, and in 1911, in the aftermath, China's imperial government collapsed. Late in the 19th century, an ugly scramble to acquire colonies in Africa broke out between European powers, eager to gain access to captive markets and raw materials. European nations simply carved up the continent between 1880 and 1900. African nations were powerless to resist European industrialized military power, particularly the rapid-fire Maxim gun. In one African battle, the British lost 20 soldiers to the 11,000 Sudanese men they slaughtered. European politicians cynically joked, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun," and they have not. The spread of Europeans in the United States also devastated native populations, forcing them onto reservations on marginal lands And in Australia and New Zealand, European diseases wiped out hundreds of thousands of Aboriginals and Maori. But how did the citizens of the West justify their blatant drive for world domination? Many argued that all past states had enhanced their own wealth at the expense of other regions. And tied to this were notions of racial and cultural superiority, particularly a belief in the superiority of their religion, Christianity. European scientists started racially classifying peoples, and arguments were promoted that whites represented a superior development of the human species. There was absolutely no scientific basis for this, of course. This was racism, pure and simple, disguised by pseudoscience. This led to another twist in European self-justification. Because the white races were superior, it was their moral responsibility to civilize the weaker races through colonization. Darwin's theory of evolution even got dragged into this idea. Some argue that the notion of survival of the fittest should also be applied to societies, so that it was natural for Europeans to displace or to destroy unfit races. This was the ideology of social Darwinism, although Darwin's own views on the concept remain unclear even today. Europeans also attempted to impose Christianity on colonized peoples. By 1910, there were more than 10,000 missionaries in Africa alone, but also their racial ideologies, rarely permitting even well-educated Asians and Africans to enter the higher ranks of the civil service. In South Africa, Europeans set up systems of strict racial segregation with separate homelands, public facilities, and educational and residential areas. In India, a rebellion erupted in 1857 caused by British insensitivity when the military began using cow and pig fat to lubricate rifles. Cows were sacred to Hindus and pigs were offensive to Muslims, and both groups saw this as an attempt to convert them to Christianity. The rebellion broke out amongst Indian troops before spreading across the country. It was crushed by the British, who then took direct control of India. The European Industrial Revolution caused immense change in the world in just a couple of centuries. A simple decision to burn coal in the absence of wood can fairly be said to have led to industrialization, innovation, colonization, mass migration, the nation state, and the justification of imperialism using racist ideology. Significantly, climate change might also have played a role in this process of world transformation, as it had done so often in the previous history of civilization. Records indicate that changes in ocean currents off the Pacific coast of South America associated with El Niño events in the 1870s triggered severe and lengthy droughts in parts of India, Africa, Brazil, and China. Millions died and economies crashed as a result, leaving those regions ripe for colonial conquest. And yet, despite these disasters and devastating rebellions in China, global populations actually rose faster than ever before during the Industrial Revolution, from 610 million in 1700 to 1.6 billion in 1900. What was the impact of all these changes on the lives of so many millions of humans, both within and without the industrialized nations? What did it mean to live through the Industrial Revolution? Many people now went to work in factories instead of farms, marking time with clocks instead of by the change of seasons, living in small families rather than extended ones, and experiencing such rapid change that it could be felt within the lifetime of a single person for the first time in the history of our species. Despite all this, key social structures remain essentially unchanged from the structures that had emerged in the first city-states in Samaria 5,000 years earlier. Elites on top, a labouring class at the bottom, and a middle class that was achieving significant gains. The novels of Charles Dickens allow us to peer into the crowded urban life of 19th century England, with its poor sanitation, inadequate water, and monotonous working conditions of the labouring class. Dickens pulled no punches in recording his disgust in books like Oliver Twist and A Christmas Carol. Many used direct action to try and improve the conditions of the working class, like the Luddites of Nottingham who tried to destroy the machinery itself, or the swing rioters of the south of England who set fire to the farms and barns of wealthy landowners. But the most influential critique of industrial society came from the German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Engels had worked in a textile factory in Manchester and eviscerated the conditions he found there in his 1844 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. 4 years later, he and Marx published the Communist Manifesto, in which they offered a comprehensive theory of human history in which the main driver of change was class conflict. Because the gap between rich and poor would continue growing exponentially in this capitalist environment, they predicted, a revolution was inevitable. It would overthrow capitalism and replace it with a communist system that would more equitably share the fruits of production. One day after the Communist Manifesto appeared in 1848, demonstrations and riots broke out in Paris, and 2 days later the French king abdicated. Revolts also erupted in the Italian states, the Habsburg Empire, in Switzerland, Spain, Denmark, and Britain, and even the Pope was forced to flee. Were Marx and Engels' predictions coming true? These revolutions of 1848 were driven by poverty and the appalling conditions created by industrialization, but the military power of the state was too strong and monarchical authority was restored. Just as the Greeks had done 2,000 years earlier, concerned governments in industrialized states used migration as a safety valve. Large numbers of impoverished Europeans migrated to the United States, to Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and Australia and New Zealand, establishing neo-Europes all around the globe. Governments also passed new political and social laws which gave their populations an increased democratic voice in an attempt to ease the tensions Marx and Engels had identified. So suffrage was extended, trade unions were legalized, and labor laws passed to improve working conditions, particularly child labor laws to prevent the exploitation of children. Industrialization affected gender relations too. Working class girls and women in industrialized nations found jobs in factories or as domestic servants. In Japan, young women from the countryside became urban textile workers, enduring appalling conditions. Within the middle class, even though families acquired more resources, the role of women returned to what it had been for most of human history, the homemaker whose job was to make a home fit for their husbands returning after a long day in the workplace. The fact that some middle-class women pushed back against this role laid the foundations for the suffragette movement that would erupt in the early 20th century. Finally, we need to consider the environmental impact of industrialization, an impact best exemplified by its quintessential city, London. Frankly, London was filthy throughout much of the 19th century. The streets were covered in horse dung, and stinking sewage flowed directly into the Thames River to be brought back upriver by high tides, causing devastating cholera epidemics from the 1830s to the 1860s. The air of London was polluted by factory chimneys and the smoke from millions of fireplaces, which combined with the natural fogs of the Thames Valley to cause a photochemical smog that killed large numbers of Londoners. In the developing world, the industrial nations treated their colonies as sources of cheap raw materials and producers of cash crops. They destroyed landscapes, forests, entire ecosystems in their extraction of gold, silver, and diamonds, and in their efforts to increase harvests of coffee, tea, sugar, and rubber. European scientists were aware of the devastating consequences of this. British East India Company scientists reported in 1852 on the probable global impacts of the destruction of tropical forests, even mentioning potential climate change. Animals also faced worldwide devastation. The fur-bearing mammals of the Russian steppes and the American prairies were pretty well exterminated by 1914, as were huge numbers of birds and their habitats. Some of this activity was purely recreational, but devastating nonetheless. In Africa, British hunters shot thousands of antelope, elephants, giraffe, and rhinoceros. In Africa, they shot tigers from high on elephants until by the early 20th century, few tigers remained. In 1900, the British government hosted the first international conference on African wildlife, which achieved little but established precedents for more productive efforts in the 20th century. All these effects were a product of the Industrial Revolution, which began on a rainy little island with the coupling of coal-burning steam engines to textile manufacturing. The age of modernity had begun. Who could have foreseen the incredible impact it would have on human lives and on the environment that sustained our species? Much had changed by the year 1900, but the amazing 19th century was destined to be utterly eclipsed by the even more extraordinary changes that occurred in the centuries that followed.